Welcome back to another exciting episode where we talk to remarkable people on topics related to medicine, culture, consciousness, philosophy, arts, and so on. So today's topic is apart from medicine, it's one of my favorite topics, and especially these days, it's one of my most interesting topic that I spend a lot of time on. We have, remember, we only talk to amazing, remarkable people in this podcast. So we have Carolyn Jennings. Welcome, Carolyn, to this podcast. We're happy to have you. Carolyn Jennings is an associate professor of philosophy and cognitive science at University of California, Merced. She works across multiple disciplines, especially neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and her work aims at understanding the nature of attention and its impact on the mind. For example, perception, consciousness, and action. And welcome to this podcast, Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Rajeev. It's wonderful to be here talking with you.
Great. So there are so many things that I'd like to talk to you about. Let us see if we can cover at least some of those. So your area of interest are attention, self, consciousness, agency, identity. And so what I did was, before jumping into this conversation, I typed in what is consciousness in this Bing chatbot, which is the AI.
Yeah.
Which is the generative AI. And I'll read out the answer to you. From there, we'll take it. Okay. So consciousness is our individual awareness of your individual awareness of your unique thoughts, memories, feelings, sensations, and environments. Essentially, your consciousness is your awareness of self and the world around you. This awareness is subjective and unique to you. At its simplest, consciousness is sentience and awareness of internal and external existence. I think they're talking about the subjective feeling of the first person experience. However, its nature has led to millennia of analysis, explanations, and debates by philosophers, theologians, linguists, and scientists. Opinions differ about what exactly needs to be studied or even considered consciousness. So what is consciousness according to what you have studied? So I'm presuming that your area of interest is mostly on the Western philosophy, Western psychology. How do you define it? Because see, I'll come to this in a little bit, but there's this thing called individual consciousness, and then there is this utopian idea, or this expansive idea called universal consciousness that the Hindu philosophers talk about, especially Advaitin philosophers talk about, or Vedantins talk about. So what is consciousness?
Yeah, so a big question to start. I love it.
I know. We'll take it from here, but let me start this. Is consciousness an emergent property of the mind, or does mind come from consciousness, from somewhere? Which way?
Okay. I guess I probably want to say neither. So wild. So the Bing chatbot's answer wasn't bad. There were some good elements to it. I guess one aspect of it that I think is pretty commonly agreed upon by most philosophers, at least, and probably most scientists too, is that consciousness does not have to include an awareness of self. So the Bing chatbot thought that it was awareness of self and awareness of world, but you could have a consciousness that's lower level, where you're not necessarily explicitly aware of yourself, So sometimes people call it self-consciousness to separate it from consciousness. And that connects really well to the Eastern philosophy stuff, because you do see very frequently in Eastern philosophy the recognition that there are forms of awareness where you lose like the self-world dichotomy, lose your sense of being a self separate from the world. I always use this with my students when I'm discussing it with them, but I love this quote. It was in a National Geographic article, I think, about an ultra marathoner, where she says that when she's running these ultra marathons, that sometimes she feels like a drop of water in the desert. And for me, that's a wonderful image of what happens to herself when she's in these kinds of states. You see it with trance and long distance running and all kinds of activities, but sometimes you do just lose yourself and you become kind of one with your environment. Right. So that's the kind of first point, that maybe some of the ways that people talk about consciousness, as you noted, might be rejected by others as being some of those characteristics might be seen as unessential and not getting at the heart of what consciousness really is. So what I like to do, and this is not an uncommon starting point. A lot of philosophers, what they'll do is they'll start with what some people call an ostensive definition. That just means like a pointing definition. So instead of giving every detail of all the characteristics of consciousness, instead you point at consciousness, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to like have a starting point for study. And my favorite ostensive definition is that it's that which separates dreamless sleep from dreaming. So if you believe that you're conscious while you're dreaming, which I do believe that, not everyone believes that. If you believe you're conscious while you're dreaming, but you think you're not conscious in dreamless sleep, and again, some people disagree with that. If you agree with that contrast, then I think that a nice thing about that contrast is that in dreaming, you're not necessarily aware of yourself. You're not necessarily thinking rationally. You're not necessarily in touch with the external world. There's a lot of things that can be absent in dreams. You're not necessarily moving your body. So I like that because I think it preserves the basicness of consciousness as a starting point, really points at consciousness itself rather than stuff that doesn't have to go along with it. And then there's this other philosopher, Manuel Vargas. He wasn't talking about consciousness, he was talking about free will, but he says about free will that if you think of the history of thinking about water, with water, they used to think it was a fundamental element. And then eventually they realized that it was made up of elements. And he says that that's a kind of, that went through a transformation, our concept of water, and that we should think of free will similarly, that it might go through a conceptual transformation. We might think of it differently when we know more about the science of agency. And that's kind of what I think with consciousness. It may be that over time, the way we think about it will shift and change as we learn more from the sciences. So my current view of consciousness is complicated, and I don't know if we want to get into that, but it is, I think, a shift in understanding. It's different from what the Bing chatbot said. I mean, it has some of those elements, but it's different in some ways too. And it doesn't fit into that question that you asked perfectly.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because not the very next question, but one of the first few questions was, what happens to this awareness of the self during waking state, sleep, and the deep sleep state, where there is non-dream or non-dream, what I call deep sleep is non-dream state, where we are not aware of anything, and all we can say is, I had a deep sleep. I was just not aware of anything. And what Vedanta, in the Indian philosophy, Vedanta says is that that says that I am not aware, that is yourself. So that is immutable. That is, you cannot deny its existence. So there is, I think you kind of hinted it in a similar theme when you mentioned very quickly about the dreamless and the dream sleep, right? So and now we're getting into this concept of the self. You say that self is real, right? So the self, or is from where you come from your standpoint, the self, the agency, the identity, the ego, or the ego self, are those all same?
Mm. No, they're not exactly the same, but they overlap for sure. So identity is an easy one to see why it's not exactly the same. So for me, like when I focus on the self and I try to give a natural basis for the self that is like an explanation of the self that's rooted in the sciences, when I try to do that, I work from a starting point of attention. So I think of the self as the thing that's directing your attention, your ability to pay attention to one thing rather than another. Like the self is behind that. Yeah, time out. Yeah.
Attention.
Yeah.
What is it? So tell us about attention and then link it to self.
Yeah. Okay. So attention is similarly, if you want to give like a kind of ostensive definition of attention, then you could say that is what that is what you pay when someone asks you to pay attention. That is what is grabbed when you feel like your attention is grabbed. So we have these phrases like, hey, you pay attention to me, or whatever like a teacher might say. So attention is that which you are moving when they ask you to pay attention. And attention is that which, if somebody like snaps their finger or claps their hands, that's what's grabbed. When
it is selective.
Yeah.
You selective of all the things that are going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
You pay attention to one thing. So there is something in you that is focusing on something outside of you.
Yeah.
I mean, this is I'm not an academia.
Yeah.
So I'm just using my own language, simple language, 8th grade language to describe what attention is.
Yeah.
So many things going on, you go out, there's all this, traffic and birds chirping and, everything going on, but your attention is on the road, nothing else.
Yeah.
Or not. You may get into trouble if not. So your attention is there's something in you, that self, just paying soul, is just focus on one pointed. So that is the attention you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
so,
I just don't think it has to be on one thing, but I agree with that's a good definition, and that's like a helpful starting point for people to understand it. But yeah, I don't think it has to be on one thing.
Yeah. So for the attention to happen, you need see, here is what I'm trying to come.
Yeah.
Buddhists say there is no self, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is anatta, anatma, which
Mm-hmm.
means there is no self within you.
Yeah.
Everything is just a collection of attributes. So if you start, as long as you don't pay attention to yourself, it has an existence. But the moment you turn around within and start asking, where is this self within me? It disappears. You can't grasp it. You can't grab it.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it does not have an existence.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, in deep sleep, there is no concept of this ego. There is no agency, because somebody can pour water so you can get into trouble, whatnot, and you can't protect yourself. There's no agency that is trying to interact with the outside or the inside, and so on. So because of this, there is no self that you can that you can pinpoint within you. But then Vedantins, who are actually, I'm kind of focusing on the Indian Buddhists and the Vedantin, which might be of some entertaining for you because you are mostly, I don't know, you may be familiar with these Vedantic or the Buddhistic concepts or not. So Vedantins say that no, even in this deep sleep, the one who says after waking up, I had a deep sleep, is that self. So without that self, how can you even say that I had? The one that I within you that says that you had a deep sleep, or I had a bad sleep, or I could not sleep, or I slept so much so that I did not know what's going on. So that is the real self.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where I'm getting to with this, but one of the podcasts I heard that you are of the opinion that the self is very real.
Yeah.
even though you lose sense of self at times, right? You lose sense of, you go on and you look at a beautiful scenery and see, I lost myself in this vast scenery. So what does your science or your philosophy say about their self? Is there no self? Or the self that Buddhists are talking is different from the self that Western philosophers are talking, is different from the Vedantins are talking. In fact, they should not be called self. Oh.
I guess my view of the self is probably like somewhere in between the Hindu and Buddhist conceptions. And we can get into the details of that if you like, but it is, I would say it is somewhere in between, but I would agree with the Vedantic philosophers that in deep sleep, the subject is still there. That's kind of how I often talk about it. I call it the subject, because the subject of attention. But I guess a departure point for me is that I think whereas the philosophers of the past, including Indian philosophers, they've really focused on the evidence you can gain from within experience and from reflection and from argument. But I'm not limiting myself to that. So I'm allowing myself to include scientific evidence in my reasoning, and to include that as supporting or not supporting the evidence from experience. So you notice, like in the back and forth that you gave, that the Vedantic philosophers are giving almost like an analytic response, that the ability to use these phrases is what supports their argument. And I don't have to limit myself to that, because I'm going outside of experience and saying, I think that there's evidence from the science that there's a self. So that doesn't mean that it's objecting to those arguments. It's just that I'm going, I think, a step further than those arguments in my own words.
So I know I don't want to get into this whole argument with the neuroscience talking about under anesthesia, what happens to the cells and so on. That's a whole different, I don't know if you have something, it's something that you can simplify for our common audience, so you can say something about it, but I don't know if you want to say something about what's done. So on the
I think that maybe like one of the easier things to see here is that what I argue in my book, The Attending Mind, is that if you look at psychology and neuroscience of attention, then it makes more sense to think that there is something responsible for attending than that there isn't. So, for example, if you think of a case where somebody snaps and that distracts you, that pulls your attention away. We have those kind of distractions around us all the time. Some of the time you aren't distracted by those things. Some of the time you continue to be focused on the thing you want to be focused on. So in this case, the podcast, maybe the snap didn't draw your attention away. Maybe you continued to listen to my voice, let's say, in the same manner you were before the snap. And if you were doing that, it might have felt like that took some effort for you to do that. Well, that signature of effortful attention, that is something that philosophers and psychologists have studied for more than 100 years to try to figure out what's going on with this effortful attention. They've studied it in psychology, and they found behavioral signatures that contrast what they call involuntary attention, like to the snap, from this kind of effortful attention or voluntary attention. And then they looked at it in neuroscience to see what distinguishes them there. And they have found that there are differences. And I think the only way, or the best way of explaining those differences, is to say that there's something, a self, that's directing attention in the case of effortful or voluntary attention. So that's the kind of summary version of the argument. It takes you have to kind of look at a lot of the science to make that case, and also look at what the contrasting explanation is to really be convinced by it. But that's the heart of it.
Very interesting. So this self that the Vedantins, the Buddhists, and the scientists talk about, what does how does science measure self? How do you quantify it? What tools do you use to quantify self?
Yeah, so those are good questions. So I would say up till very recently, I don't think that there have been very good tools for that. So there have been indirect tools. So for example, there have been these tools of looking at attention and looking at these kind of involuntary versus voluntary attention and looking at the contrast there. So there's a study, for example, where to look at the difference between those two types of attention, they have the person have something in their environment kind of grab their attention, like something kind of light up, or they ask them to direct their attention to the same location using an arrow. And then they just look at how their behavior is different from when something lights up and kind of grabs their attention from when the arrow directs their attention. Really basic, low level stuff like that. But more recently, there have been some attempts to target something close to what I think of as self more directly. So Giulio Tononi has been working on a theory of consciousness, and his theory of consciousness has developed tools that I think could be used to separate self from non-self. There's a neuroscientist.
What is a non-self?
Well, non-self in this case would be anything that isn't contributing to the causal power of the entity in question. So Giulio Tononi, again, he's focused mostly on consciousness, but he's focused on when something has causal power, what we call like a macro level. So when something has causal power that's not reducible to its parts, he's been working on tools that can help you to identify that. So anything that wouldn't be contributing to that macro level causal power would be the non-self, things that aren't part of that self.
Okay, I'll get to this causal power in a moment.
Yeah.
Written it down. But so basically, rather than, because it is impossible or difficult to actually quantify self, you look at the cognitive attributes or characteristics of the self and say, because of these characteristics, this is self versus this is non-self. Or, I don't know, did I?
No, yeah, that's right.
Because, you have this memory, retention, that feelings, emotions, pain, things like that go around this abstract concept of the self, all these attributes, this cognitive attribute. So for instance, when I examine a patient, I say, I have this mini mental state exam, for instance, in dementia, you check many things, what we call cognitive capacities. So there are multiple cognitive capacities, and you give a score and say that this patient has dementia or whatnot. So you have all these cognitive faculties that are properties of the self. And therefore, by picking one of maybe attention is one of the properties of the self. I don't know. And you pick up one of these attributes and examine it and say, and then all these scientists, I don't know who connects all these dots together.
Well, I think that's not exactly how they work on it. Although, I think it's more like this, that.
Did I totally screw it up?
No, you did not at all. It's a different way of thinking about it. So I'll try to draw it together. So I think the idea is something like this, that your ability to direct attention, that's the foundation of self, because that's the foundation of.
Attention is the foundation of the self, not the other way.
That's right. Yeah. Because that's the beginning of you having some kind of causal power. So basically in philosophy, and I think this is the same in all the different branches of philosophy, it's very standard that people think that something exists only if it has its own causal power. And so if you want to say the self exists, then you want to be able to show its causal power. So if self is something in the world, you have to show, what does the self do in the world? And basically attention is the thing people think the self does. But you asked a question earlier, like, what is the difference between self and identity for me? And one of the differences, I think, depends on memory. So self, in this really basic sense of separating the self through its causal power using attention, and self as an identity, I think that depends on memory. So attention is necessary to have any causal power, but memory like kind of gives the layers of the self that provide identity. And so you could lose your identity through dementia, lose your memory, but you still wouldn't lose self in this more fundamental way, because you'd still have this capacity for attention. And so you'd still be apart from the world. You'd still have your own causal power, even if that's not rooted in certain historical features of you that are preserved usually in your memory, if that makes sense. So it's not supposed to be that we're just like getting one little piece of the self at a time with these cognitive functions, but rather that attention is special in that it's at the very heart of what the self is. That if you didn't have attention, you wouldn't be a self at all, basically.
Very interesting. So when let us say I have let's have a real patient, actually, I don't want to say patient, real individual. Okay. So who has like end stage dementia? Okay. So severe dementia.
Mm.
The person cannot recognize their child, their son, daughter, spouse, or themselves. You ask their name, they can't say it. Mm-hmm. You ask where they are. We usually say alert oriented ×3, time, place, and person, and they cannot identify any of that. But the person exists. But the person is at risk for aspirations, is at risk for anything the world, all the dangers of the world. He or she cannot protect himself from outside or the inside. Like for instance, person is falling, he cannot catch on to something, it just falls because it does not have orientation of the surrounding. Yeah. You are saying that there is a self that is still preserved despite all these cognitive faculties that have diminished or deteriorated, almost negligible capacity, but there is still attention. I'm trying to understand my understanding of attention is, hey, be attentive, right? So be attentive, listen to me, watch what you're drinking. You may aspirate, so don't fall. There's water on the floor. The cognitively impaired person cannot do these commands, or does these commands in a very poor way and gets into trouble. And therefore, we have to support him, give him nourishment, give him, put him in a nursing home and things like that. So this is not the attention you are talking about.
No, it is. It is. So probably the patients that you're talking about, they might have a form of dementia that affects like their frontal cortex, affects their executive functioning. Maybe they're not as good as you were saying at like planning motor actions.
Yeah, you can have frontal lobe dementia. You can have microvascular dementia and so on. But when you have this Alzheimer's dementia, which is like a global type of dementia, they're almost all cognitive.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
no. Yeah. So there's also types of dementia, but I was assuming because you were talking about like them losing their powers of attention, that makes it sound like it's affecting their frontal lobe probably in some way, whether it's because of frontal dementia or because of Alzheimer's. That's a pretty severe type. So the question of whether there is a self, I think, can be separated from the question of whether it's the same self or whether it's a robust self or whether it's a high functioning self. And I think here, like you're saying, it would probably be someone with what I'm saying is I think if they still have the powers of attention, even if they're very minimal, then there still is a self there. It may be a far diminished self, an unrecognizable self, et cetera. Yeah.
There is this one question that I don't want to say this was the reason why I wrote my first book on unbound intelligence, but that one question that I started off with that book is, what happens to the self when the person dies? I pronounce the patient, when you say pronounce the patient, you pronounce them dead, right? So they call, when I was doing all critical care, a lot of critical care, they would call me, I was a house doc, they would call me to pronounce a patient dead. then I'll go and do my things, like you listen to them, you have this, are they breathing? Do they have a heart tone, a heartbeat? Do they respond to your sternal rub? Do they respond to your verbal commands and so on? They don't respond, so they are gone. But what happens to the self when that person, in other words, what is death at all, in the first place? So is it the death of the self? Is it so what happens to this self? I don't know where I'm getting to with this, but then I think because we are talking about the end stage dementia where the person starts to lose all the cognitive capacities or abilities, and then there's just that bare self that is still there. And then when the person passes, the self disappears. Does it? What happens to it?
Yeah, that's not something that I've covered in my research, I would say. So I don't cover.
Does it ever, I know it's probably not something that academia, that you don't do in research because it's non-testable hypothesis, right? So you cannot, I don't know if you can test the hypothesis or maybe they're testing it, but anyway, so I don't want to push you beyond your limits, but that's something that that the theologians talk about, that the philosophers of Vedanta and others talk about. They talk about there is a self within you. It's like opening a box, the self within you becomes one with the universal self. So it's like the electricity that comes out from the main meter into your house, it just merges with the universal self. So that is a whole different, I think that is a whole different concept. When people talk about, when the philosophers talk about the self versus the scientist, not the kind of philosophers that you are doing, you are a scientific philosopher. I'm talking about the Vedantic philosopher. I think they talk about two different selves, right? So the self that merges into the air,
I think it is. I think this is another helpful departure point that the kind of self that I'm arguing for, it is like a naturally based self. So it is based in kind of scientific findings, empirical findings. I think that what you see typically with Vedic philosophy, Vedantic philosophy, is something closer to it's not a dualistic ontology. I guess it's a monist ontology. This is something you may be able to tell me more.
Non-dualistic. So there are dualistic and non-dualistic. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. But it has a different, it's experience is the basis rather than material or matter being the basis. So it's difficult to translate from one to the other, but what minimally would not be the case in the version of the self that I'm thinking of is that when the brain cells die, the kind of self that I'm talking about would not exist anymore, because the kind that I'm talking about is coordinating brain activity, basically. And that self is just not going to be there it's constructed of brain activity and it's coordinated brain activity. So if the brain is dead, then that self is dead too. That doesn't really speak to some of these other ideas that are out there, because I think that they work in parallel to what I'm talking about. But I'm certainly not giving any credence to those ideas either. I'm not supporting them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Because of the empirical evidence or lack thereof. So the self and the consciousness of the agency, the attention that you are interested or you're studying is based on the brain firing.
Yeah.
And the brain activity, right? So as the brain cells, as they age, they lose their vitality, the firings, and tell us about a little bit what happens with the brain firing. You had this oscillation theory. Tell us a little bit about what is that that generates the cell?
Yeah, those are really good questions.
Or consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, consciousness I do think of as a separate thing, but the self, or the thing that's directing your attention, the way that I understand that is that you can break it down in terms of interests. So every living being has an interest. Even like a worm has an interest in avoiding caustic substances, and will avoid them. Every living being has things that they prefer and things that they disprefer. And humans are not really different in that respect. We have interests too. We have an interest in red things, for example. We really like red things. We tend to like kind of focus on those when we're presented with them. We like good smelling things. So we have things that we prefer. We have things that we disprefer. And the way I think of the self or the subject is that it is the collection of all of your interests. And the idea is that for attention to work, your interests have to work together. They have to coordinate. And that what the self is the coordination of those interests. So if you have an interest in like things like loud sounds, that's one of your interests. You also have an interest in philosophy. That's another one of your interests. They're competing when we're talking and then I'm snapping my fingers at the same time. So you do get this competition of interests too. And which one your attention is going to remain on will depend on that coordination of those interests. And so what the self does for you, I think, is it coordinates the interests in order to direct attention. And it's difficult to translate that exactly into, so an interest is not the same as brain activity. Brain activity is necessary for interests, but it's not identical to interests. So one way that I try to translate from one to the other is that you can think of interests as the tendency for the brain to seek out and respond to stimuli in a certain way. Mm-hmm. But even if you think about that way of talking about it, like what does it mean for a neuron to seek out and respond to a stimulus? What does it mean to tend to do that? That is not that way of thinking about it, which I think is necessary to explain what an interest is, just doesn't map on exactly to just neural firing. Neural firing isn't the same as tending to respond in a particular way. And I think in order to get that more complicated idea, the mental idea of an interest, you have to look at more than just neural firing. But I think it's possible to tell the story through the brain. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, is to explain what the self is through its interests and explain what interests are through the brain. It's complicated.
So the interests change from time to time, from age to age, from period to period, from place to place, and so on, right? So ultimately, you can change your interest based on or using chemicals, using practices like meditation, pranayama, and things like that. So ultimately, your focus is on attention, and of course your book. I'm going to leave a link for your book, The Attending Mind, for our audience. So that's great. So I think what I feel is everybody is trying to study a part of this consciousness, this self, this awareness, and so on from a certain viewpoint. And the human mind can't seem to put all this together. Do you think AI has some role here? Oh, by the way, coming to AI, intelligence and consciousness, right? So AI is artificial intelligence. They didn't name it artificial consciousness. Do you think these machines would ever become self-conscious?
My current belief, so this is another place where I haven't really done very much work. In fact, I've done no work in this area of what's going on with artificial consciousness, artificial intelligence. I do teach a class on consciousness, and we cover that as like one of the topics in the class. And of course, I listen to other people who talk about it. I'm interested, like you, in the subject. But right now, I would say it's not like a professional opinion. It's more of like a kind of gut instinct but my gut instinct is that that artificial intelligence will happen, but that artificial consciousness won't. That's my gut instinct. And that's based on something closer to like what Evan Thompson argues. So Evan Thompson has a bunch of books. Actually, you mentioned dreaming. If you haven't seen his stuff, you would love it. He has a book called Waking, Dreaming, Being. He connects actually Indian philosophy.
Oh, yeah. I heard about
philosophy. Yeah, he was really great. But
I think he draws a lot from Vedanta.
He does, yeah. He does, yeah. And Buddhist philosophy, yeah.
And Buddhist, yeah.
But he says, he has another book, Mind in Life, where he argues that consciousness, the mind, are rooted in living things. And I've seen some other arguments on that too. And that is kind of what I'm currently thinking, is that to get an interest, basically, to get consciousness, I think you need a self. And to have a self, I think you need interests. And to have interests, I think you probably have to be a living being. And so that's why my gut instinct is saying that. But I haven't done that work. I haven't done those arguments, so I can't really, say that for sure. But or even sure for myself, much less sure for others.
Yeah, that makes sense. You never know what people are capable of these days. But so consciousness and intelligence, these are interesting. So when I typed in what is consciousness in the chat bar, what it does is it scans throughout the cyberspace and collects data from wherever it can, from Wikipedia, from whatever sources, and then summarizes and puts it and gives it to you. But that is a great thing for a term paper or a thesis or an exam question. But I don't know if it digs deep into all this Tibetan psychology. I mean, there is so much that they talk about consciousness, and there are like hundreds and thousands of books or so much written about this. And sometimes even in Hinduism, there are these Vedantic schools that they don't agree with one another. So maybe we're coming to the end of it. One question that has been studied that also is one of my interests is, are these selves connected? Like the self within you, the self within me, the self within somebody else, or you and somebody else across the continents? Is there any? They talk about quantum mechanics and all this. I'm a simple guy. I don't understand so much quantum stuff. So what does your science tell about? Is there a connection between self to self? If so, what?
I guess
what is it?
I would say normally they're not connected. So the way that I think of the self is that it's this coordination of interests, and that is a kind of coordination of your brain activity. And normally, our brains are set up very nicely to be distinct from one another, typically, right? They're like encased in a special shell that prevents the electrical activity from kind of spilling out, but keeps it very well contained inside. And so the physical basis of the brain makes it very natural that our cells would be disconnected. But there are exceptions to that. There are sometimes there are claims of multiple cells within the same brain. There have been claims of that. And there are also sometimes, congenital twins and stuff like that share a brain. There's two twins that share a thalamus, which is like a really important like central hub in the brain, that seem like they have some kind of they're more connected than most of us are. So it's not that I think it's impossible to have a connected self. It's just, it's certainly not typical. And I'm getting really interested in now to what happens when we coordinate across people, whether you get something like attention at a social level. That's something I'm exploring right now. That wouldn't be the same as sharing a self, because you would still have, each individual self. But the question is, do each of those individual selves sometimes coordinate in a way that looks like the coordination of interests within a self? And I think that's a really interesting question. And so,
so we know that when when you, let us say, when you chant a mantra, or when you even in singing in choirs in places like that. So as opposed to doing it in isolation versus doing it in groups, and when the group sings in the same vibration or in the same frequency, you see that there is that kind of. They have done studies where choir singing controlled the heart rate. The heart rate of the participants actually went down and was actually in unison across the whole group. And then there is diminished anxiety, there is a sense of bonding, and there is a sense of connection, there is sense of sharing. And in some sense, the boundary between oneself to the other, they still maintain their identity, but then there is this that hard boundary between oneself to the other starts to dissolve. So there are a lot of, the one I quoted for singing was from many years ago. So I'm sure they've done more studies on it. So in that case, you can actually influence, just by your presence, the interests of somebody else by your presence, right? So the interest in the way you defined it, the interest of yourself, of the other person. And by changing the interest, you are actually, you are changing the self, or you are changing how the self behaves, I think.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So where does the boundary between this self and the world, where is this boundary between the self and the world? When you say you became selfless, or you had this out of body experience where you start seeing the world completely differently, your interests change, so on and so forth. So I think the self that we are talking about has this malleability, but then it is still there, but then it start seeing. See, for instance, when I had my, I don't want to say out of body experience, where you would start seeing yourself in everything, or you would start the boundary pretty much dissolved, and there is no sense of identity within yourself. Why does that change the person? Why does, either by chemicals or by physical exercises, like going to a place like Himalayas and other places, or sitting in the midst of an enlightened person, or sometimes spontaneously, why would such an experience change the person? What is it that changes within?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and I don't really have an answer to that. I do think there's kind of two pieces I think could be useful in thinking about that. One is, the way I'm thinking of the self is that the self is actually drawing its own boundary between itself and the world. So the self is determining what gets included and what does not get included in terms of its interests. And that's very similar to what a cell does. In protecting itself, the cell decides for itself what gets to be in the cell and what does not. It's determining its own boundary, and that's how I'm thinking of the self too. So same kind of like homeostasis like work.
Do you think the cell has a self?
No, I don't think that there's like a meta self, but the self is determining its borders.
But it is conscious, isn't it? It has interest.
It is conscious, but I don't think I'm not thinking of consciousness, I think, in exactly the same way that most other people do. But the other piece that I think is useful here, so one is that you're right, that border can shift. And I think it's shifting partly because of the self. So in coordinating the interests, sometimes it makes sense to get rid of some interests and get new interests. But the other piece is that there's a graduate student at UC Merced actually who works on altered states. And they're really interested in how there's a kind of neural plasticity that it seems like a lot of them tap into. So what sometimes seems to happen with many of these different altered states, the chemically induced ones, the behaviorally induced ones, is that they they allow for kind of plasticity that you don't normally see, and they allow for greater transformation that isn't normally accessible to you. And my guess is that that's one of the reasons that those experiences feel so meaningful and feel so transformative, because you're like, literally there's a more like brain change in those periods than there normally is. And so the very structure of the self is probably changing in those periods, because those experiences or chemicals or whatever are allowing for greater change. And those are really interesting experiences for that reason, I think.
Yeah. One of my friends does treat patients with ketamine who have severe depression, resistant depression, they have not responded well to the medication. So he does this protocol where they go through the ketamine, and then they have this reset of their brain circuitry, and then some of them, the lucky ones, come out of it, and sometimes they go back into depression after go through another.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, this idea of how you can, because people seek out for this. People go to gurus. People take this mind altering substances to get that high, to get that feeling of. See, I guess the more open the self is, the happier it is.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, why would people seek out for it, right? So the more constricted it is, the more depressed it is, I would say. The more sad it is, which is why you feel better after these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
That's my theory. That's why people seek out for it. And then just while you were mentioning about the cell and the consciousness and cell not having the consciousness, it just occurred to me that, let us say you are a cell and I'm a cell, like within, right? So there are two cells talking to each other. And the one cell, between them, they would define the consciousness differently than what humans define, like the whole organisms define. Yeah. Because we are an ecosystem of all these organisms. Yeah. Right? So we are two-thirds of us are microbes, only one-third is our own. Yeah. And we talk about microbiome and other things. So when the individual cell looks at other individual cell and says, "Oh, this thing is dead. He's not conscious anymore," or he's not behaving properly because he's getting into trouble, or the cell became malignant cell.
Sorry, there's thunder. I don't know if you hear that. There's a storm in the background.
Oh yeah, that's okay. So a cell turns rogue and becomes malignant. Right? So how a person can become a terrorist and start destroying others. The cell can become malignant and start destroying. Yeah. I don't know. I am of the theory that the cell itself every cell has consciousness, but not the same way we define it. Mm-hmm. It's by consciousness, I mean self-preservative capacity. The cell moves, some cells move, like red blood cells and other things, they move, and then they multiply, they change, they interact with when microbe, like let's say white blood cell, when microbe attacks, it knows that microbe attack. How does it know? There is some level of rudimentary awareness that each cell has, right? And then you may not define that as awareness or consciousness the way the whole organism defines it. But there is this tiny little awarenesses that the whole, because if there is something that bites me here, the whole body is reacting. It's just not me. That's why the white blood cell count goes up wherever you get the blood in the body, because the blood cells are circulating, telling the other cells, "Hey, look at there, the corner of that finger, something is happening. So better get ready if something bad happens." Things like that. So I see this on a daily basis in patients when every the parts of the body react differently when something else happens. Mm-hmm. For instance, you have a urinary tract infection, the person gets confused. He may not have any other symptoms. All they have is a state of confusion, or it's just not feeling good. Those sorts of things. So, well, anyway, that is my intuitive understanding. I don't do research on it, but that's my understanding. Maybe if you have somebody come up with it, with an idea to test it or whatever, that would be an interesting hypothesis.
Well, Rajeev, I think you would really love Evan Thompson because it sounds very similar to some of his views in Mind and Life. It's this book. It's he wrote it a few years back now, but you can see even, he has like the cell on the cover.
Oh yeah.
He's really focused on this, on life as the source of the mind and consciousness. And the way you described it does sound really consistent with the way he sees it. When I talk about consciousness myself, I focus on, this is partly because the evidence I'm drawing from is really centered on humans.
Yes.
But for me, when I talk about consciousness, I talk about it as a relation between the subject and its world. And so you don't have consciousness of the type I'm talking about unless you have a subject, and you don't have a subject unless you have attention. And I don't think that every living cell has attention. So for me, that wouldn't be consistent with what I say about consciousness, but that doesn't mean that there can't be a different type of consciousness like you're saying. I don't rule that out. It's just not the type that I'm talking about.
It's at that level, it's different. The
right.
And conditions of that organism at this level of higher consciousness is very different than, for example, they studied the way mushrooms behave. Right? So mycelium behave. So they interact with not just the trees, but the plants and one mushroom to another mushroom. And there is this whole number of books written on it and this whole science going on, multiple projects. So that's what I meant to say. Not the same that you just cannot pick this definition. It's like apples and oranges, right? You just cannot pick this definition and say, hey, cells have. But
that makes sense.
I think that we have come to the end of it, but my understanding, come to the end of this conversation. My understanding is just like you cannot universalize a definition to different levels of life, you cannot universalize self in every aspect. Like when Buddhists say self, they may mean something different. When Vedantins say self, they probably mean something different. And the problem with this is they're written in a different language, Pali language for Buddhists, Sanskrit for Hindu literature. And then when you try to translate them to English, it becomes a mess, and then, anyway, mess not for you because you are in your area of interest. So people trying to say, oh, can religion and science meet at some point? And then they start raising these universal consciousness. And then there is this Prakriti and there is Purusha. You have done yoga. You are a yoga trainer. So you know Prakriti and Purusha, the Sankhya philosophy that talks about, I'm writing a book on the philosophies of India.
Cool.
Then there's Sankhya and Yoga that are like sister or brother philosophies that one is based on the other. Sankhya is the philosophy, Yoga is the practical application of it. So when you start superimposing those concepts into the neuroscience, like how some of these Vedantins are doing these days, I think everybody gets confused. But anyway, so great talking to you, Carolyn. So thanks for spending some time. So I'll leave some links of your book and some relevant articles in the description. So audience, who are listening to this, please share your experience of your, your knowledge, your experience in consciousness, self, out-of-body experience, and so on. So I hope to meet you at some point soon and have another conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds great. This has been really fun. Thank you so much, Rajeev.
Thank you.